says he wants from Congress. Plus, the latest shakeup in the White House. President Trump bringing in his third national security advisor to replace H.R. McMaster. We'll look at what the former UN Ambassador John Bolton brings to the table and how he could affect showdowns with Iran and North Korea. And terrorism again strikes France as a gunman kills 3 people before French police take him down. That's all ahead in this hour of Shepard Smith reporting. I'm Trace Gallagher in for Shepard Smith. President Trump says he's unhappy about signing a massive spending bill into law, but says he had to do it.
While we're very disappointed in the $1.3 trillion, nobody more disappointed than me because the number is so large, it'll start coming down. We had no choice but to fund our military because we have to have by far the strongest military in the world.
The president signed the bill just hours after he threatened to veto it. That would have forced the government to shut down tonight. The president tweeted this morning, quote, "I am considering a veto of the omnibus spending bill based on the fact that the 800,000-plus DACA recipients have been totally abandoned by the Democrats, not even mentioned in the bill. And the border wall, which is desperately needed for our national defense, is not fully funded." DACA, of course, refers to undocumented immigrants who came to this country as children through no fault of their own. The spending bill doesn't address them. Some Republican senators had urged President Trump to follow through on the veto threat, not over DACA, but because they oppose the massive price tag. In the end, the president gave it the okay, but said he would never sign a bill like that again. Let's get to the chief White House correspondent, John Roberts. He's live for us on the North Lawn. John.
Trace, good afternoon to you. This has been a real roller coaster. You remember a couple of days ago, the congressional leadership came to the Oval Office and was in a conference call with the president. They walked him through the omnibus bill. The president signed off on it, said that he was going to throw his support behind it. Then we had the veto threat this morning. And then ultimately this afternoon, the president held his nose and signed it. The reason for that being that this omnibus spending bill provides for a $60 billion increase in military spending to some $700 billion. That's the biggest ever. It's $716 billion next year. And it ends the defense sequestration cuts that James Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, says have really hobbled the military over the last few years. The president did threaten that veto this morning, which is when the defense secretary got on the phone to him and said, Mr. President, I really don't think that this is where we want to go with this. But we don't know. I mean, this just could have been a threat from the president who was never really serious about it because ultimately, he said, he had to sign the bill because of the military spending. So on his way out of the diplomatic reception room this afternoon, I asked the president, well, why threaten to veto it?
Thank you.
Mr. President,
Thank you.
Why did veto the threat if you had to sign the bill?
Well, you'll figure it out in about 20 minutes after you look at it. Okay? We're going to figure it out. You're going to figure that out. We looked at it a veto. I looked very seriously at the veto. I was thinking about doing the veto, but because of the incredible gains that we've been able to make for the military, that overrode any of our thinking.
Tracy pointed out in the top that the president also didn't like the bill because there was no provision to protect the so-called dreamers, nothing for DACA. This afternoon in the diplomatic reception room, the president reached out to dreamers saying he tried to help them, but the Democrats didn't want any part of it. Listen here.
I say this to DACA recipients, that the Republicans are with you. They want to get your situation taken care of. The Democrats fought us. They just fought every single inch of the way. They did not want DACA in this bill. I do want the Hispanic community to know and DACA recipients to know that Republicans are much more on your side than the Democrats who are using you for their own purposes.
You pointed out, Trace, that the president said he would never, ever sign a bill like this ever again. But with the budget process so horribly broken on Capitol Hill and for so many years, you could probably put down an even bet that the president will face another omnibus spending bill at some point in the future. Trace?
Yeah, let's even money. John Roberts, stand by if you will. The bill showdown came after the latest shakeup at the White House. President Trump replacing his national security advisor, General H.R. McMaster. The White House had previously denied media reports about McMaster leaving. Last week, the president said the stories were, quote, very false. But last night, the president confirmed John Bolton will take McMaster's place. Bolton was a U.S. ambassador to the UN during President George W. Bush's administration. In the past, Bolton has called for the U.S. to bomb Iran and launch a preemptive strike against North Korea. Bolton has also repeatedly defended the U.S. invasion of Iraq, something President Trump has called a terrible mistake. The National Security Advisor position does not require Senate confirmation, so Bolton is set to take over in a few weeks. Let's go back to John Roberts at the White House. John.
Trace, if you had money on the McMaster horse finally leaving, thinking about an exit plan from the White House. It happened right after the leak of that classified memo that was prepared for the president ahead of his call with Vladimir Putin of Russia. But I'm told that that didn't really factor too much into this. It was the fact that the president never really gelled in his relationship with McMaster. And yet every time he sits down with John Bolton, he thinks to himself, I really, really like this guy. You pointed out that John Bolton's got a hawkish view of foreign policy, certainly on Russia. He appears to be much more strident than President Trump does. But in an interview last night with Martha McCallum on the story, Bolton said despite his past comments, he is going to keep his counsel for the president. Listen here.
I've never been shy about what my views are, but frankly, what I've said in private now is behind me, at least effective April the 9th. And the important thing is what the president says and what advice I give him.
And that's always a wise thing for an aide of the president. What's important is what the president thinks and the advice that I give him. This did seem to happen pretty quickly yesterday afternoon. You know, in terms of the timing, this was definitely a snap decision. The process to get here took a long time. John Bolton was in the Oval Office yesterday afternoon. He left the White House knowing that he had the job, but he didn't expect that the president was going to suddenly tweet about it and tell the world. So that took him by surprise a little bit. One other thing, Trace, that's bubbling up again, it's kind of on a slow rolling boil here, is the imminent departure of the VA Secretary, David Shulkin. There was some indication it might happen as soon as today. They might wait for this Inspector General's report to come out, but the consensus here is that he's gone at some point.
And, John, for the record, I had zero money on the McMaster horse pulling out, but $2 on Bolton coming in. I can tell you that right now. A lot of other people did, too, John.
I had a lot of money last week right on the McMaster departure, and it did finally pay off.
Yeah, you're in better tune than I am. John Roberts live on the North Lawn. John, thank you. President Trump calling on the Senate to change its rules after he decided to sign that spending bill.
To prevent the omnibus situation from ever happening again, I'm calling on Congress to give me a line item veto for all government spending bills, and the Senate must end. They must end the filibuster rule and get down to work.
But don't count on that happening. The Republican Senate leader has said he does not support ending the filibuster rule, and the Supreme Court has ruled that line item vetoes are unconstitutional. Let's get to the chief congressional correspondent, Mike Emanuel. He's live for us on Capitol Hill. Hello, Mike.
Trace, good afternoon to you. President Trump says he won't sign another one of these mega funding bills, so that suggests a showdown perhaps as soon as this fall. This particular $1.3 trillion funding package was negotiated between the big four here in Congress, McConnell, Schumer, Ryan, and Pelosi, in a bipartisan fashion. It is not clear how differently they'll be able to do future spending packages. And Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said numerous times he does not want to change the rules of the Senate to get rid of the filibuster. It's a rare bit of leverage the minority party has, which one day will be the Republicans once again. A veteran Republican senator talked about how difficult it is getting things done.
You've got a political situation where the House doesn't have a lot of flexibility because of divisions within the conference, and the Senate's got a 51-49 majority. So because of that, I mean, you don't have any wiggle room. And the Democrats leverage some power out of that narrow margin that we have. And why they didn't use that power to get DACA out, I'll never understand.
It is worth noting some of the president's allies here on Capitol Hill are working on budget reform. It will be interesting to see if those talks can produce results and perhaps a neater process going forward. Trace.
Yeah, and this time yesterday, Mike, the Republican leadership was pretty much on board saying the president would sign this. What did the Democrats say about the president's veto threat?
Well, they're saying, this was the product of bipartisan talks. When both parties sit down at the table and negotiate together, you get some of what you want. You have to give to get what you want, essentially. And then a Maryland Democrat senator took this swipe at the president.
You've got a president who claims he's the great negotiator, the art of the deal. Where was he when the deal was being made? Wakes up the next day and says he wants something different. He is actually one of the worst negotiators I've ever seen.
With the $1.3 trillion government funding package signed, the threat of a government shutdown is gone until at least the end of September. Expect much of the rest of this year here on Capitol Hill to be about those midterm elections in November. Trace?
No doubt. Chief Congressional Correspondent Mike Manuel, he's a veto threat, because yesterday at this time it seemed like the Republican leadership was all on the same page that he was going to sign this thing. This morning we get the tweet that he might
make of it, because it wasn't just Republican leaders, Trace, who were talking about the White House was on board. It was the president's own budget director in the White House briefing room yesterday who said the president was going to sign this bill. And he acted today as if this was all a surprise. Congress and the White House is always in negotiations on this. They came up with this idea, the spending plan, which everybody talked about, busting the budget $1.3 trillion 6 weeks ago. All they've done over the last 6 weeks is put more details into the spending. But this was already agreed to then. And I have to say also, for the president suddenly to talk about DACA and the wall, Democrats came to the White House and offered the president a deal in return for protecting 1.8 million dreamers and people eligible for that. They were going to give them the $25 billion of spending for the wall weeks ago. The president turned it down, said he wanted the end to the visa lottery, a sharp restriction on chain migration. Not to say it's right or wrong, but again, you sort of wonder, where has the president been while he and his team have been negotiating for months on all these issues?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I was watching, kind of switching over now to H.R. Master and John Bolton. I was watching your exceptional coverage yesterday, Chris, when this announcement came down, you and Jennifer Griffin and Catherine Herridge. And the common theme in that seemed to be that, look, we've got John Bolton, who's against the Iran deal. He does not think we should deal with North Korea. He thinks the U.S. Embassy in Israel was a great idea. But he also made it very clear that the president is the one who got elected and the president makes the decisions.
Yeah, I mean, having said that, H.R. McMaster wasn't trying to overrule the president. He's a general. He's part of the military command. He understood who got elected. I think that the switch from McMaster was more about personality than it was about policy. What I'm told is that the president likes a freewheeling discussion. McMaster would get in there in sessions with the president, and he briefed him almost every day, and it would be very orderly. Point one, point two, and long details as to why point one should be this way. And the president didn't like it, and in fact even sometimes ridiculed him and said, why are you so serious? Now, having said that, John Bolton is pretty serious too and has very strong opinions when it comes to foreign policy, and I'm curious to see how the two of them are going to get along. Frankly, also curious to see the dynamics of the new foreign policy team, because you're going to have Pompeo in for Tillerson, you're going to have Bolton in for McMaster, and then and I can't wait to see how McMaster gets along with James Mattis, the retired general and defense secretary, because they both have pretty strong opinions and somewhat different. Bolton definitely more of a hawk than Mattis is.
Yeah, and speaking on that, I want to give you John Bolton's opinion back in August, because you've interviewed him a million times, and so have I. He's the same on camera as he is off, and he said this, quoting, North Korea test launched on Friday its first ballistic missile potentially capable of hitting America's east coast. He goes on to say that if thereby proved the failure of 25 years of U.S. non-proliferation policy, a single-minded rogue state can pocket diplomatic concessions and withstand sustained economic sanctions to build the deliverable nuclear weapons. It is past time for Washington to bury this ineffective carrots and sticks approach. What do you think of this upcoming summit between Kim Jong-un and Trump? Does it happen?
It certainly indicates that at least the advice, obviously the president will decide what he wants to do, that the advice from Bolton is going to be pretty tough. He has said he thinks that the president ought to go in there, I'm talking about before his appointment yesterday, and basically say to Kim, look, Are you going to denuclearize or not? And if Kim says, hems in any way, say, well, we're finished talking. John Bolton had an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal just a week or so ago in which he laid out the legal case for a preemptive strike on North Korea. Now, if you're going in there to try to say, look, if you don't basically surrender now, it's going to get very ugly very quickly, then Bolton may help. But if the president really is willing and
A New York City firefighter died overnight battling a fire on a movie set. Fire officials say Michael Davidson somehow became separated from his crew and got injured. He died later at the hospital. Davidson had worked for the New York City Fire Department for 15 years. The fire happened on the set of the movie Motherless Brooklyn in Harlem. It stars Ed Norton and Bruce Willis. The New York Post reports Norton saw smoke and told a cop. The movie producers expressed their condolences and called Davidson and the other firefighters real-life superheroes. Meantime, Islamic State terrorists claim one of their soldiers carried out a deadly attack on a supermarket in southern France today. Happened about an hour south and east of Toulouse. French police say the attack lasted for hours. It's from the Fox Business Network. Deirdre, I feel like you and I are doom and gloom in these
Yeah,
scenes.
we should take this on the road, Trace, but in the meantime, this is a clear sell-off. So the Dow levels that you just mentioned are below the February 8th lows, and if you recall,